We've discussed how we must use a virtual camera to view the contents of a 3D scene, but as we also know from the real world, nothing is visible without light. So in 3D graphics, we simulate the effect of light illuminating surfaces, and this involves the use of different types of virtual light sources. So let's get started discussing these different types of lights available to us in 3D software. So I've got Maya open here with just a very simple scene setup, just looking through my perspective camera here at a plane with a just a cube hovering over top. I'll turn on the resolution gate here so we can see what the perspective camera is framing. And let's begin here with ambient light. And just do keep in mind, I am using the Maya software renderer here, just because Arnold does not actually work with ambient lights. So we are going to have to view this using the Maya software renderer. So I'll go ahead and just create an ambient light. Now, to be quite honest, these aren't really used a whole lot because the result is fairly unrealistic. Right, ambient lights give uniform brightness to the scene. What I'm gonna do here is actually head over to the attribute editor, turn the ambient shade to 0. This will have the ambient light source behave normally, if you will. Let's go ahead and render that. We can see it's actually kind of difficult to see the cube, but there it is, right? If I get a different angle here, we can see that the ambient light source is just providing just an overall brightness to the entire scene. By the way, this ambient shade, all it does is it kind of causes the ambient light source to behave more like an omnidirectional point light source, which we'll talk about in just a second. But yeah, this with that slider, that ambient shade value turned to 0, this is how ambient lights generally behave across different platforms, right? So uniform brightness, let's change the brightness or the intensity, and we can see that affects how much light or how much illumination is being given to all surfaces. And we can see here that, well, the effect here is pretty unnatural, right? This light source has no source, really. It just globally illuminates the scene. And there's also no light decay with distance, right? Because the position of this light source here doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where we put this. There's going to be no decay or light attenuation with distance. Again, an unnatural phenomenon. We know that this light source basically results in physically impossible lighting. And, this kind of global fill light, if you will, is often achieved using other methods, whether it be global illumination, which it's more of a rendering topic, or perhaps an image-based light, right? That's a good way of getting kind of global brightness added into your scene. We'll talk about image-based lights at the end of this section. Okay, so there's your ambient light source. Under certain situations, it could be useful to just kind of give a global or to globally raise the brightness of the entire scene. However, or even to soften the effect of other light, right? You could do that with it as well. However, we're not going to see these light sources in use all that much, as the effects are quite unrealistic. So that's your ambient light source. All right, so next we'll talk about directional lights. Again, in Maya here, I'll just go ahead and create a directional light source. I'll just move it up here so we can take a look at it. So we can see that the preview here just gives us a bunch of arrows, so that's kind of interesting. And what we're going to find is that directional lights simulate a light source essentially positioned infinitely far away in the scene. So again, the position of this light source does not matter. The only thing that is going to matter is the direction, as the name suggests. So without moving it at all, I'm just going to do a test render. We can see that only one side of this cube is illuminated. However, if I change the orientation of this light source, we can see that that starts to get some more interesting results here. We can cause this light to come in from any direction. And again, if I move this, there will be no effect. Doesn't matter where this light source is positioned, because the effect we're simulating here is actually that the light is infinitely far away. And so for certain light sources, such as, if you're trying to simulate the sun, this actually does work quite well, because for all intents and purposes, the sun is just so far away from the Earth that, by the time light rays, or because of the distance, the light rays that hit Earth are more or less pretty parallel to each other. And so we are going to be getting very hard lighting, hard shadows out of this. So in many situations, because directional light sources are actually pretty fast to compute, it makes a lot of sense actually to use something like this instead of trying to simulate like an area light for the sun or something like that. There are situations where this can be quite useful. But yeah, let's just differentiate this from the ambient light source, right? So rotation does matter here. And a few other details about this. Again, position is relevant. The light intensity does not decay with distance because, of course, position is irrelevant. So we can expect a uniform intensity coming from a particular direction. And if we go ahead and have this light source emit shadows, now we do have ray trace shadows turned on here, but of course the Maya software renderer is not capable of ray tracing shadows, so I will actually switch over to the Arnold renderer here so that we can take a look at the shadows cast by this light source. And right, as I just mentioned a few moments ago, the shadows that we see cast from a directional light source will be perfectly hard, because again, the light source is being simulated as being infinitely far away. So the light rays which hit the object and which cause shadows to be cast are technically completely parallel to each other. So that's why we're getting completely hard shadows. So that's an important thing to remember about directional light sources, about the type of shadows that they produce. All right, so there's your directional light. All right, so from here, we can move on to point light sources. And so this starts to get a little bit more interesting here. So I'll go ahead and create a point light source, and I'll just move that a little bit and get a test render here. All right, so the scene is pretty dark. I'll start by just raising the intensity of that point light source a little bit, just so we can see what we're doing here. All right, so that is a good start. All right, so let's take a look at the effect of using this point light source. So point light sources are omnidirectional. Very different from the directional light source. In this case, the location of the point light source does matter. If I created some more objects here and positioned them around the scene, we would see that they're all being illuminated from the position of this omnidirectional light, or this point light, right? So you can think of it kind of like a light bulb that just sends light rays off in every direction. All right, so with this one, the position does matter, but the rotation, of course, does not, right? Because it is omnidirectional. And we are going to see a very interesting feature of a light source come into play when using point lights. And that is light decay, because of course we are considering position now. So as is the case in the real world, let me just clear this rotation. As is the case in the real world, with distance from the energy being emitted by the light source does decay over time, over distance. So over in the attribute editor for the point light source, we can take a look at this decay rate setting. We can see that it's currently set to no decay. One thing I am going to do actually is go back to the Maya software renderer, because Arnold uses different settings to deal with the decay rate of a light source. So we do need to set this back over to Maya software and probably turn the intensity down a little bit just to see the effect of this decay rate setting. All right, so let's start with that. So we can see that currently this point light source is set to have no light attenuation, no decay to the energy being emitted from the light source. So in fact, if I just move this light source backwards, we can see that there actually is no effect. There is no effect on the brightness on the surface of these objects, because the light is not decaying at all. That does not change with distance. So we can take a look at these different settings here. We can take a look at a linear decay rate for the light. So this basically, there will be a linear relationship between the distance of the light source to the subject and the resulting brightness or illumination on the surface of the object. So I can just move this light source away from the subject bit by bit, and we can see how quickly essentially that light decays. All right, so that's interesting to see. Let's put it back here and switch this over to a quadratic decay rate. This is in the real world how light decays. So if we want to have a point light source accurately behaving as it would in the real world, we'd use a quadratic decay rate, and we can see that. The relationship between energy and distance is basically the light is going to decay as 1 over the distance squared. So it is going to, the light is going to decay faster with distance here, faster than with a linear decay rate. We can see that already, just moving the light all the way out here, there is basically no more illumination on the subject. Right, we can bring it back here, and we can see the cubic decay rate. This is basically 1 over distance cubed, and so we can see that the light simply attenuates faster, even faster than it does with the cubic decay rate. Okay, so again, quadratic is what to use to mimic a real-world light decay. However, very often we are going to be basically cheating light sources just to get good results from an artistic perspective, right? We don't have to be physically accurate if breaking the laws of physics actually give us a better or quicker result, right? So that's always important to keep in mind. But there's a quick description of how decay rates work with light sources. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's take a look at another light source, and that is going to be the spotlight. All right, so let's move this up here. Gonna Just zero out the X and Z translations for that cube. Also going to give this spotlight a rotation just so it is pointing roughly down onto the scene. And let's take a look at what this gives us. All right, so let's do a test render here. All right, there it is. And I'm also going to switch back to Arnold renderer just to get those ray traced shadows again. All right, so again, in shadows here, we can see that ray traced shadows are turned on. And let's bring that intensity up a little bit just so we can see exactly what we're doing here. Pretty dim. All right, that should be good enough for what we're doing here. All right, so spotlights are a little bit different. They kind of combine the best of both worlds that you get with a point light source and a directional light. And basically with a spotlight, we are able to cast a decaying light, except only from one direction. And we have the illumination kind of limited to a certain cone being projected forward by the light source. And we can see that cone being kind of previewed here with the preview of the object itself. Now, because there's basically just more features to a spotlight source, of course, there are going to be more options to work with here. So let's take a look at those. Of course, we have the same decay rate settings as we do with a point light source, but we also have some other things as well, such as the cone angle. So currently, this cone angle that we're looking at here is set to 40 degrees. We can perhaps increase this. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So by increasing the cone angle, we can see that the resulting surface area that we're able to illuminate with the light source does increase. Can make that pretty big, or very narrow if we need to, just very selectively light a single part of the scene. We can set that cone angle however we need to. All right, there's also the penumbra, which is, let's just bring that in. Let's dial in a penumbra value. And this is going to help simulate basically light fall off from the edges of the cone. So let's just compare let's bring this back to 0 actually. Take a look at the edges of the cone, right? The edges are perfectly hard. There is no simulation of like a fuzzy edge or something like that, which of course we would be seeing in the real world. So if we start dialing in a penumbra value, you can visualize this as from that hard edge, a certain, again, it's a certain degree value. If you visualize this, a certain degree, like coming off of the hard edge on both sides. That's what this penumbra value is. It basically takes that hard edge and softens it out. And we can dial in whatever we like here. And that's a very large penumbra value. Can bring down the cone angle to actually be able to see this very, very soft edge on the being projected onto the plane itself. Let's bring the penumbra back to 0. All right, so that's the penumbra angle, not to be confused with the drop-off value, which is going to look quite similar to the effect of the penumbra. However, it is fundamentally different. So I'm just going to drop my cone angle down a little bit just so we can clearly see what's happening here. And I'm going to bring in a very small drop-off value. Let's start taking a look at what this does. All right, so 0.2, 0.3. Let's see if that gives us a good result. Yeah, there we go. So see, even if we zoom in here and take a look at the edges of this light cone as it is projected onto the plane, we can see that the edges are actually not kind of softened here. That is not what the drop-off does. What the drop-off does is basically causes light to fall off from the center of the cone. So if we imagine basically this, this light cone being intersected with this plane, the light right at the center of that circle is going to have the highest intensity, and then it's going to fall off from that center point. So if I continue to raise the drop-off value, we're going to see that we get more and more of this drop-off from the center until, I mean, even 0.8 is almost completely blended, like fading out from the center. Let's get a value of 1 here, and we're going to see that gives us a perfect light drop-off from the center of the circle, or the intersection of this, the plane cone intersection, if you will. So that is your light drop-off, or the spotlight drop-off. And finally, we have the area light. So let's go ahead, let's get rid of that spotlight, and we could create an area light from just the standard lights menu in Maya here, but I'm actually going to go ahead and create the specialized Arnold area light, just because it is specifically designed to be used with the Arnold rendering engine. So let's bring in this area light. We can see that it's or the appearance of the object is a little bit different, and this has to do with the properties of the light source and just exactly how it works. So we can see that the preview of the area light is actually this rectangular shape, which is going to make a lot of sense when we understand that area lights are actually designed, they're designed for simulating like real world light sources, and they do this by actually emitting light from a physical surface area. So that's why we see this rectangular shape, right? We're not emitting light from an infinitely small point or from some point infinitely far away. We're actually emitting light from a physical surface area present somewhere in the scene. This is how real lights work. So let's go ahead and just get a test render here so that we can see what we're doing. I'm going to raise the intensity of this just by, again, heading over to the attribute editor. The scale of the scene, we haven't really drastically changed the scale of the scene, so we don't have to mess with this exposure value. If you do basically either scale up or scale down the scene drastically, you will have to start by setting the exposure correctly. But for now, we can just make very fine adjustments using the intensity value. So let's start with an intensity of like around 8. That'll work for this scene right here. And what we're going to find is that we can create either hard lighting or soft lighting just by, like transforming the light source, the area light itself, right? And again, this is like if you were in a studio working with like physical lights, you would be doing the exact same thing here. Okay, so here are the core rules to remember when working with area lights. So larger area lights are going to create softer lighting. So I'm physically going to scale up this area light. We can make it nice and big here, and we're going to notice, actually, let's just bring that intensity up so that we can see what we're doing. We're going to notice that this creates nice, soft lighting. Look at that. I mean, we can hardly even see the shadow. It is so soft. Scale it down a little bit. Still, we're getting a very, very, very soft light and very soft shadows here. All right, so that is what happens when you work with a large light source. Now, smaller light sources, on the other hand, create harder lighting. All right, look at that. Just by scaling down the area light, we are creating harder lighting here. Let's take a look at that shadow. And we can see that it has been hardened up considerably. you know, very small kind of blurred edge there. Of course, it still is somewhat soft because this light source does have a physical area. However, it's not infinitely small. Therefore, the edges of that shadow are not perfectly hard. We can get as close as possible to that, perhaps by shrinking down that light source such that it is tiny, and we get pretty hard shadows, but still there will be some blurring, some realistic softening of the edges there. All right, so that is what to keep in mind about the physical size of the light. But there's something else we can do here as well to control the hardness or softness of light. So let's get kind of a middle of the road scale here for the light. Something like this will work fine. And we're actually going to mess around with the distance of the light source to the subject. So let's see what happens when we move the light source really close to the subject. Well, I mean, we can see the how the illumination on the subject itself has changed, right? That makes sense. We get this nice big bright spot because the light source is very close to the object. The light it decays less. It has decayed less by the time it reaches the subject. But let's take a look at that shadow. All right, that shadow has actually become softer than it was when the light source was back here. So that tells us something rather interesting. It tells us that the closer we move the light source to the subject, the softer the lighting will be. And of course, we looked at all these facts when we talked about lighting in general back in the cinematography lecture. All right, so the closer the light source is to the subject, the softer the lighting, and the farther away it is. Now it's going to be fairly dark here. Let's increase the intensity. Maybe I'll bump the exposure a little bit because we're starting to mess with some quite a bit of distance here. We really should just make an overall adjustment to exposure and leave the fine tuning for the intensity value here. All right, but nevertheless, with considerable distance here, we can see that has the effect of hardening the light source. All right, so again, there was no change in scale for the area light in this example. We simply moved the light closer to the subject to soften the lighting and moved it farther away from the subject to harden the lighting. All right, so that is another important thing to keep in mind here. Now, we're going to find that area lights often have settings which control the shape of the emission surface. So it's kind of cool here in Maya with this Arnold area light, we can actually change the light shape to, for example, a disk. In fact, let's just get this light source real close to the surface of the plane, and let's turn the intensity down real low here so that we can try and see the shape. All right, we're not going to see. Maybe if we get it real close here. Can we start to see that square shape there? Not very well, but the point being that if we change the light shape to a disk, this actually physically changes that surface area from which light is being emitted. So pretty useful there in case we did not want the light being emitted from a rectangular shape. And we're also going to find that we can actually do other scaling transformations to this light source as well. Right? We could actually make this not square, but rather rectangular like this, and that'll have that'll have a certain effect. We can see the effect that that's having on the shadows. We could do it the other way as well, create a really long but short light source as well, right? So that the physical shape of this object is taken into account when casting light from the area light. All right, so really, really nice to work with. And there's some other settings here as well that we will be talking about once we get into more rendering related things. So yeah, that will become more relevant in the future here. All right, now something just quickly to note, as we're using the Arnold area light just to do different test renders, is to just note the lack of light decay options. And that's because Arnold is a physically based renderer, and basically light decays as it does in the real world. So there's actually no decay rate options here like we would find with a point light source or a spotlight. And of course, that's because, like, by default, Arnold is as much as possible trying to have your light sources behave as they do in the real world. Now, there is something we can do with a light filter to, kind of like simulate the effect of a decay rate, and that can be added to an area light. But in most cases, we can just leave the light attenuation to the rendering engine and just have it behave naturally. Again, there's so much control we actually have over area lights, given that we can control their surface area and the distance from light source to subject to get the light to behave exactly as we want. So generally, we don't really need to mess with the light decay. However, again, as I said, it is still possible. We do that with a light filter, but usually not necessary when working with these Arnold area lights.